LabSciencePodcast.com. Professor Sense here for episode 30. If you're listening to this episode, this is actually the first time we're doing our show both with an audio version and a visual version. So if you prefer to see me, head to our YouTube channel. The link is in the show notes. If you're watching on YouTube, hi for the first time. Thank you for joining us. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about something that's a bit basic, but really important to get your head around. And that's the difference between condensers and dynamic microphones, and more specifically, when you should use each. So to start off, let's define the two. A condenser microphone versus a dynamic is very similar. The main difference between the two is how they capture and then output the audio. So in the case of a condenser microphone, which you see in most studio setups, you have a diaphragm, which is the little circular kind of membrane that's in the capsule of the microphone. That diaphragm is on a plate. And anytime you speak into a condenser microphone, that diaphragm moves. And it basically outputs an electrical charge that then, when paired with phantom power, goes into your amp or goes into your audio interface and you get sound. Now, because of the way this physical setup is ran, and because it does also include external phantom power or 48 volt power, the signal from a condenser microphone tends to be really full. There's a lot of fidelity. You get all of the full frequency spectrum, and it tends to be a lot hotter, a lot louder than a dynamic microphone. Dynamics also use the diaphragm or that capsule, but instead of there being a plate and an electrical output to get you that audio, there's actually a wire coil, and that's used to get the audio and amplify the signal a little bit. So in terms of differences, the condenser microphones, because of this plate setup and because of this high quality plate setup, they tend to be a lot more delicate. Conversely, if you look at a dynamic microphone, it's a lot more rugged because of the coil setup that it has, but the overall output tends to be a lot lower. It also deals better with louder signals. So now that we have a basic idea of the differences between the two microphones, you might be thinking to yourself, well, it sounds like I should always use a condenser. You know, they have a fuller frequency range, they're louder. Granted, they're a bit more delicate, but that's probably for good reason, right? Why would you ever want to use a dynamic microphone? Well, I can think of a lot of reasons, and one of them probably affects a lot of folks that are watching this video, especially if you're recording at home. If you are a vocalist recording in your house, or you record other people in your house, and the room is not treated, or the room is not isolated, meaning the sound that's outside can get in, you have no control over the street noise or your neighbors, condensers may not always be the best move. Now, in a studio environment, it's fine because you have a treated and dead room. There's no outside noise leaking in for the most part. And as such, even though a condenser is really sensitive and picks up a lot of ambient noise, there's no bad noise for it to deal with. You know, everything that you hear in a studio tends to be what you wanted to hear for the recording. Now, when you're in your bedroom, you don't have control over that street noise like you would. So if you have a really strong condenser microphone that's great at picking up the room, your voice is going to sound great in it, but so is the ambulance outside. I picked up a lot of my early experience as an engineer and as a producer around New York City working with rappers. And a lot of rappers had mics in their crib and they had an audio interface and Pro Tools, and that usually was it. There wasn't any treatment in the room. They weren't always recording in studios like I mentioned. And so I learned really, really quickly that as fun as it would be to use the condenser mics that I had, I needed to make sure I had at least 2 or 3 dynamics with me so I had some options in case the rooms were loud. And more often than not, I ended up using those dynamic microphones. You would be really surprised how many times a Shure 58 was actually the better decision than a really, really high quality condenser, because the condenser was picking up all of that off-axis noise. So if you're in a place that has a lot of noise you can't isolate, really put some consideration into whether or not your room will support a condenser microphone. And it may make more sense to actually put that money into treating the room than getting a condenser. Something else to consider is what type of source you're going to be miking. You know, different instruments respond differently to dynamics versus condensers. I think instruments that, or voices even, I consider the voice an instrument, that require a lot of nuance and a lot of fidelity obviously should have a condenser as their first consideration. But what if you're miking percussionists? What if you're miking drummers? What if you're miking really loud audio? If you're doing Foley work, for example, sound effects work, sound design work, where you're banging things and just ripping sounds apart. Sometimes condensers are too sensitive for this type of material, and as such, you just don't want to use one. You'll distort the signal. So I find that if I'm tracking drummers especially, I'm pulling out dynamic microphones, and most engineers are too, unless they have a condenser that is best suited for percussion, and then they usually use some type of gain reduction in the tail end to deal with that. But my main point is, if you have something loud and transient, especially if you look at a waveform, especially for like a drum sound, that first transient is really, really pronounced and really big. That's the hit. And then you immediately see that signal decrease in sound afterwards. And in order to capture that full frequency, that full dynamic range properly, you need something that can handle the big transient at first before things start to get lower and lower and lower and lower. And dynamic microphones are absolutely great for that. One other thing that I really want folks to consider, and this is more for people that are trying to buy their first microphone, if you plan on leaving your mic out day in and day out, which is something that I really recommend for songwriters, for producers. I have a 58 kept on a stand all the time because you never know when inspiration is going to hit. And when it does, you want to just be able to grab the mic and start recording. If this is something you plan on doing, it may make sense to have a dynamic mic for this purpose. I'm not a fan of leaving my condensers laying out and about all day for weather related reasons, but more for clumsy related reasons. I knock shit over all the time. And I would rather have, a dynamic mic in that stand that can take that abuse instead of having my high quality vocal mic on a chain get knocked out and about and then it doesn't work anymore. So if you're thinking about your first studio mic and it's really just to catch your ideas, get your references down as a producer, you might not necessarily need a condenser microphone for that. Something to keep in mind. So these are some ideas to consider. If you have any questions about condensers versus dynamics, that's what I'm here for. Hit us up at labsciencepodcast@gmail.com. If you have some episode ideas you would like explored, please let me know. I love to help you, especially when I know exactly what you need. And if you are watching on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe below, as we'll be continuing these episodes with the video format going forward. Till next time, it's your boy Sense. Peace.